Ever since I was a kid, I loved science. I actually wrote on my notebooks, Mark Alpert, future scientist. And when I got to college, I majored in astrophysics because I loved the stars and looking at the sky. And when I was at Princeton, I worked on Einstein's theory of relativity, an application of it, how it would work in two dimensions. And I loved doing it because it was filling whole notebooks with equations, and that was always my dream. But at the same time, I was also writing poetry because I didn't see that much difference between poetry and astrophysics. They're both about appreciating the beauties and wonders of the universe. And so when I graduated college, I thought, well, I want to try poetry now. And so I did that in graduate school and had a wonderful time writing poetry for 2 years. And then I needed to get a job. So I started working in journalism for small newspapers and then for magazines. And then I sort of came full circle about 10 years ago when I started working at Scientific American. And now I get to write and edit stories about science. And so it's great to see how much has changed since I studied astrophysics and physics in college. In 2004, Scientific American ran a special issue on Albert Einstein. While I was editing one of the articles in that issue, I became fascinated with Einstein's search for a unified theory that could explain all the forces of nature. And as I looked into it more, I began to wonder, well, it's always been thought that he didn't succeed in this quest. I mean, all of his published efforts obviously proved flawed, but I thought to myself, well, what if he actually had succeeded? What if he'd come up with a unified theory? What would he have done with it? It's not necessarily true that he would have immediately published the thing, because you got to understand, in the years right after World War II, Einstein agonized over his responsibility for the atom bomb. I mean, obviously, he wasn't part of the Manhattan Project. He didn't actually had any role in building it, but the concept of nuclear fission is based on E equals mc squared, the formula that he devised in 1905. And so obviously he felt a terrible sense of responsibility. He's often quoted as saying, if I had known what they would have done with my theories, I would have become a shoemaker. And so it occurred to me that if he actually had come up with a unified theory, he would have looked very, very carefully to see if there were any dangerous implications about this theory, and he possibly wouldn't have published it if he'd come up with it. So that was sort of the genesis of the idea. I said to myself, you know what, this sounds like a thriller. What happens is, in the beginning, our hero, David Swift, is a Columbia University professor who studied with an assistant to Albert Einstein, Dr. Hans Kleinman. And in the very beginning of the book, Hans Kleinman has been brutally attacked and tortured, and he's called David Swift to his side. And as the old man is dying, he starts rattling off a series of numbers to David, and it becomes clear to David that this might have some relation to the work that Hans Kleinman did with Albert Einstein back 55 years before. And immediately then, David doesn't exactly know what he's heard, but immediately he's being arrested by the FBI and pursued by this vicious Russian mercenary and chased, across the country. And so, because all these factions are desperate to unravel this unified theory that could have such powerful implications. The idea here is that this is a theory that could explain all the forces of nature. And when we come up with a new theory, you never know what kind of applications could come out of it. I mean, no one realized that Einstein's special theory of relativity would lead to weapons at first. In fact, even Einstein poo-pooed the idea. He said, the idea that this could lead to chain reactions and the splitting of atom for energy, he said the chances of that would be like shooting for birds in the dark in a country where there are few birds. And yet within 10 years of him making that statement, they actually had developed the atom bomb. So it's impossible to say what terrible things would come out of a final theory. In my book, I propose one possible. I don't want to give it away exactly what it could be, but scientists have talked about possibilities. I mean, a lot of the current real hypotheses that have been proposed for a theory of everything include this idea of extra dimensions, dimensions that we can't see, dimensions that are folded up so tightly that they aren't measurable under ordinary circumstances. Well, whenever you have a high curvature of dimensions, you also have the possibility of high energy that's encased in that curvature. And so if there's any way to tap into that energy, that certainly is a possibility. I mean, I'm just speculating here. No one at this point knows what the theory of everything will be. But given the history of man's terrible exploitation of scientific theory to create weapons, it certainly gives one pause.